An old story, one that had faded into the corners of forgotten streets, had quietly made its way to St. Mary Mead, a peaceful village where only the stillness of the roads knew its arrival. In the heart of the village, where life continued its course as if nothing could disrupt its rhythm, a chilling mystery awaited. When a long-buried secret resurfaces, it doesn't just stir the village, it whispers through every soul. Beneath the calm surface of life, one question lingered: if we unravel this mystery, will we discover something about ourselves that we never expected? St. Mary Mead had always worn its calm like a badge, narrow lanes flanked by ivy-covered cottages, laughter shared over fences, and scandal rarely escalating beyond someone planting roses too close to the boundary line. But on this particular morning, a shiver ran beneath the cobbled streets, carried on a fog that pressed against windows like the breath of something ancient, something watching. The mist clung tightly to hedgerows and chimneys, blurring edges of the familiar, and into this strange hush came whispers, uneasy, fragmented, and charged with the kind of urgency people pretend isn't gossip. Miss Merrill walked through it all with the quiet steadiness of someone who had seen too much to be startled anymore, her grey coat brushing against damp leaves, her eyes sharp beneath the softness of her demeanour. The villagers outside Iris Henderson's cottage stood huddled like sheep, awaiting the storm, their eyes wide, voices low, and despite their best intentions, curiosity bleeding through their restraint. They said she'd been found like a figure in a painting, still, composed, eerily untouched, as if death had entered the room not with violence but with invitation. Iris Henderson, known more for her sharp tongue and endless tales than any true malice, had never seemed the type to meet such an unnatural end, and yet, there she sat inside her parlor, hands folded in her lap, a navy blue dress smoothing her frame, her body so perfectly arranged it felt wrong, as though someone had staged the moment for an unseen audience. The air was thick with the scent of lavender soap, and something harder to name, like the residue of something sacred desecrated. On the low table before her rested a tea tray untouched, the edge of a scone bitten but uneaten, and across her lap, the flower, a white lily. Too symbolic, too deliberate. Miss Merrill's breath caught as her mind began knitting connections with silent precision. First a playing card at Peter Abbott's scene, now this, another calling card, another mark of intent. Henry Graves stood by the doorway, awkward and deeply unsettled, his fingers flexing against his sides as if unsure whether to salute or shield himself. "Same thing," he muttered, voice low, no struggle, no signs, just sat down and, his words trailed off into silence. Miss Merrill barely responded, already observing. Her gaze moved across the room, curtains just slightly misaligned, the sugar bowl's lid not quite seated, as though whoever had been there last wasn't just in a hurry, but wanted someone to notice. Her fingers brushed across a bookshelf until she found it, a narrow faded book of nursery rhymes, its cover softened with time. Inside, delicately pressed, was another white lily, its petals yellowing at the edges, fragile as memory. She closed the book slowly, her mind echoing the rhymes: a stolen tart, a weeping queen, a maid in flight, and now a funeral bloom. The story was writing itself through symbols only those who truly watched would understand. She turned, and there was Henry, watching her with the wary patience of a man accustomed to being outpaced. "You've got that look," he said, "like you're already seeing pieces fall into place." She offered a faint smile, eyes still on the room around her. "Not all the pieces yet, Henry. But I can hear the music of it, the rhythm beneath the silence." Outside, the village lived on in its ignorance. Doors creaked open, deliveries were made, laughter flickered from the pub, but above it all, invisible to them, the pattern deepened. The killer wasn't finished, the stage had only just been set, and the next act was already waiting in the wings. The drawing room exuded a brooding silence, the kind that seemed to hum beneath the ornate ceiling, like a secret not yet spoken, as if the air itself remembered every whisper and betrayal that had ever passed through those walls. Faded portraits loomed like silent judges from their heavy frames, their eyes watching, always watching, while the thick velvet drapes hung like sentinels of old sins. This wasn't just a place where tea was served and polite conversation flowed. It was a room where unspoken truths had fermented for generations, and today there was something different in the air, a tension so palpable it clung to the skin. Dolly Bantry moved through the ritual of pouring tea with soldier-like precision, as though maintaining this domestic routine might somehow keep chaos at bay. Her husband, Colonel Bantry, stood rigidly by the hearth, arms folded tightly across his chest, not the stance of comfort, but of a man trained for combat, who now found himself in the disquieting fog of a different kind of battlefield, where the enemy was unseen and the rules unknown. Spread across various armchairs were the other villagers, Dr. Ellsworth, the town physician, his jaw set with quiet dread, Reverend Milton, kind-hearted but visibly rattled, and Miss Merrill seated serenely with her knitting in hand, eyes sharp and inquisitive, beneath a veneer of detached amusement, as if she were merely watching a play unfold, when in truth, she was its invisible conductor. "We can't go on like this," Dolly said finally, lowering herself into a chair, her voice brisk but brittle. "2 deaths in less than 2 weeks. People are beginning to look at their neighbors like caged animals waiting for one of them to snap." Colonel Bantry let out a low grunt, and who can blame them? First Abbott, then Iris Henderson. If there's a pattern here, we'd best unravel it before that blasted constable stumbles in with another pointless curfew. Dr. Ellsworth stirred his tea absent-mindedly, but didn't drink. "There is a pattern," he said, voice quiet but firm.
Listen.
No signs of struggle, and then, the flare. First a playing card left on the body, now a flower placed like a tribute. He glanced toward Miss Merrill. She set down her knitting. "Yes," she said, "the challenge lies not in noticing the symbols, but in understanding them before a third body turns up." A long uneasy silence followed. It was Reverend Milton who broke it, his tone tinged with desperation. Could it be madness? Some lunatic? Miss Merrill smiled gently. "My dear Reverend, madmen tend to be chaotic, messy. Our killer, however, is anything but. This is a mind that savors precision." Dolly leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You have a theory, Jane. I can see it in your clever little face." Miss Merrill offered a mild shrug. "Only the beginnings of one, but yes, a pattern is forming, and I suspect it didn't begin with Abbott or Iris. I believe this has been long in the making." Dr. Ellsworth frowned. "Long in the making." Miss Merrill's voice dropped slightly, her tone now tinged with certainty. "Revenge, Doctor, a carefully aged grudge. Whoever our murderer is, they've been rehearsing this, plotting every step like a composer arranging notes for a final performance." Colonel Bantry exhaled sharply. "Do we at least know what links the victims?" Miss Merrill folded her hands neatly in her lap. "We do." Every head turned toward her. She allowed a small smile to touch her lips. "I believe we are being led through a rather twisted nursery rhyme." Reverend Milton blinked, confused. "A nursery rhyme?" Miss Merrill nodded slowly. "Yes, the card, the flower. They're not arbitrary tokens, they correspond to lines in an old rhyme. One about betrayal, loss, and punishment." Dolly gasped softly. "That horrid thing about the King of Hearts and the stolen tart." "Precisely," Miss Merrill replied, and for a moment it seemed even the fire in the hearth dimmed. The room felt colder, heavier, as the childish innocence of the rhyme twisted into something far more sinister. "But Jane," Reverend Milton began, "that's just a children's rhyme." She turned her gaze to him, steady and unblinking. "The simplest stories are the ones we remember best, Reverend, and those who carry old wounds, especially the kind that never healed, often crave justice with a touch of poetry." Dr. Ellsworth shifted in his seat. "You're suggesting the killer is reenacting the rhyme?" Miss Merrill inclined her head. "A stolen tart, a sorrowful queen, a fleeing knave. And now a flower, the kind one leaves on a grave. Each line unfolding into reality, each death a stanza. And I fear the final verse may already be written. Miss Marple's gaze lingered over the group, her eyes sharp, as if piercing through the very fabric of the conversation. I believe we are watching an old crime, buried deep, being repaid step by careful step, she remarked softly, each word laced with an unspoken weight. Colonel Bantry exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. Then we must stop this lunatic before they finish their twisted game. Miss Marple's eyes briefly flickered to the flickering flames in the hearth. Yes, she murmured, we must. And yet there's a thought, persistent and nagging, that lingers in my mind. Who in this village of St. Mary Me has spent all these years nursing a wound so deep, so forgotten by most, that they are now ready to settle an old score? And how many more verses of the rhyme are left to play? The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting shadows that seemed to dance like spectres of the past. Outside, the village settled into a disturbed and uneasy night. The shutters closed earlier than usual, and the familiar sounds of evening walkers had gone suspiciously silent. Fear, an insidious and unseen force, had crept into the village like a slow poison, tainting every moment of daily life. Even Miss Marple, seated in her familiar armchair, felt its sharp sting, a woolen shawl draped around her shoulders, her knitting left untouched on the table beside her. She allowed herself to feel the weight of the day, a day where every whispered theory over tea, every hushed murmur at the grocer's, and every furtive glance exchanged between villagers had been laced with the same unspoken question: who will be next? 2 murders, Peter Abbott, the former schoolmaster, and Iris Henderson, the widow, both poisoned, both carefully staged with deliberate symbols left behind, a playing card, and a white lily. Mary Me was no longer the village of familiar faces, it had become a village of shadows, of suspicion, of secrets so thick, they seemed to cling to the cobblestones themselves. Miss Marple had seen this before. How once violence took root in a place, it spread like ink in water, tainting every conversation, every passing glance. This was no longer just a village of small grievances and long-held resentments. It was something darker, something that gnawed at the edges of everyone's lives. She sighed deeply, rubbing her hands together in a vain attempt to warm the chill that had crept beneath her skin. There were moments, rare though they were, when she wondered if it wouldn't be better to leave such matters to younger, more official minds. After all, she was just an elderly woman, a retired governess, a quiet spinster, well past the age when she should have resigned herself to a peaceful life. Yet that had never been her way. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that evil didn't announce itself with trumpets. It didn't wear the obvious face of a villain, it often hid in plain sight, nestled in the most unsuspecting corners of life, behind polite smiles, beneath well-measured words. Evil had a way of making itself comfortable, becoming a quiet part of the fabric of daily existence, so that no one noticed its presence until it was far too late. It was precisely because she was old, quiet, unassuming that people tended to forget she was always watching. And oh, how she watched. She reached for her notebook, flipping to a fresh page, the rhythmic scratching of her pencil against the paper almost soothing in its familiarity. The pattern, she wrote, underlining the words sharply. Beneath she listed the known facts: Peter Abbott, former schoolmaster, poisoned, found with a playing card, the King of Hearts. Iris Henderson, widow, poisoned, a white lily placed on her lap. A playing card, a flower. Miss Marple tapped the end of her pencil against her chin thoughtfully. There was a pattern. She turned to the previous page, where she had written the lines of the old nursery rhyme. The King of Hearts, he made a tart, and so they stole it, plain. The Queen, she wept, the Knave, he fled, and never was seen again. A stolen tart, a grieving Queen, a vanishing Knave, the pieces fit too perfectly, too deliberately. Miss Marple's heart tightened. She had no doubt now, the killer was following this rhyme, using it as a grim blueprint, But the question that lingered in her mind was one that only the killer could answer. Who was playing which role? She exhaled slowly, writing down a name beside Peter Abbott's. The king, she murmured softly to herself. A man with a quiet past, with secrets buried beneath layers of time. Was it possible his own history had caught up with him? Had he been targeted for a crime long forgotten? And Iris, the queen. But Iris was not a woman known for grief. Widowed for years, her sorrow had faded long ago, replaced by a sharp, controlled demeanor. No, Miss Marple thought, Iris did not fit the mold of the weeping queen. The puzzle was far from complete, but the pieces were beginning to fall into place, one step at a time. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she studied the list before her, her mind piecing together the eerie puzzle that had begun to unfold in the village. The pattern was becoming clear, yet with every new revelation, the questions only grew more pressing. Not a woman consumed by sorrow, she murmured, her voice low, as her gaze flicked over the names again. If this truly is the pattern, then who or what does she represent? Her fingers tapped the edge of her notebook, as she glanced once more at the empty space beneath the names. The knave, the one who fled. A sense of foreboding settled in her chest. The next victim, had they already been chosen? The thought was like a cold hand gripping her heart. The murders weren't random, no, this was a deliberate, chilling game. A story unfolding with ruthless precision, and if she was right, and her instincts never failed her, another death would follow unless she acted swiftly. Her fingers tightened around her pencil as she leaned closer to her notes, her mind racing as she sketched the first line of what she hoped would be the answer, before it was too late. Somewhere in St. Mary Me someone was playing a dangerous game, and Miss Marple intended to end it before the final verse was sung. The village, for all its quaint charm, was not used to fear. It had always been a place of familiarity, where the postman knew everyone's business before they did, where the grocer's boy still tipped his cap to passing ladies, and where the most pressing concern of an ordinary day was the proper etiquette of borrowing a neighbor's pruning shears. But tonight was different. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, the soft ticking of the clock, the only sound in the room as a cup of tea cooled beside her. She had just reread the note that had slipped under her door that morning. It isn't over. Watch the clock. The next will be soon. The note had no signature, but its quiet urgency sent a chill down her spine. She'd learned long ago that such messages, when wrapped in mystery, were often more than just words. They were warnings, signals, hidden in plain sight. Watch the clock. Miss Marple's hand instinctively reached for her notebook, flipping through the pages, the familiar weight of her task grounding her. She had recorded every detail of the case with precision, the deaths of Peter Abbott and Iris Henderson, the playing card left with Peter's body, the white lily resting on Iris's lap, the link to the old nursery rhyme, and then with a jolt, she saw it. A simple fact she had noted days ago but had yet to fully comprehend. Both victims had died on the anniversaries of events tied to an old forgotten village scandal. Peter Abbott's murder had occurred on the anniversary of his own disgrace, the day he had been dismissed from the parish, his name tarnished forever, vanishing into obscurity. Iris Henderson had died on the anniversary of Sarah Pemm's mysterious disappearance, the young woman whose ruin had been conveniently erased from the village's collective memory, buried beneath the weight of time and secrets. Now, with the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her pencil. The next significant date, tonight. The note had been clear, but now the reality of the situation hit her with full force. The killer was following a timeline, a dark script they had set in motion. Time was running out, and she could not afford to waste another moment. She rose swiftly from her chair, a sense of urgency propelling her forward. The past week had been spent meticulously untangling the webs of history, but now she was running out of time. The future was rushing toward her, relentless, and she could not allow the murderer to strike again. The village clock tower, standing solemnly in the heart of St. Mary Me, chimed once, the toll reverberating through the night, its sound a slow, deliberate heartbeat that seemed to echo across the village. The warning from the note rang in her ears, "Watch the clock." The air was thick with the damp scent of rain-soaked earth, and a dense mist curled around the hedgerows, obscuring the edges of the village as three shadowed figures stood outside the old vicarage. The clock tower had just struck 11, each toll a stark reminder of the diminishing minutes. Miss Marple, wrapped in her practical woolen coat, stood with Colonel Bantry and Constable Graves, both men showing varying degrees of skepticism. Colonel Bantry, who had always preferred the more direct, traditional methods of dealing with problems, had reluctantly joined the vigil. "I still don't understand why we couldn't have done this from inside the pub," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably in the cold. His tone carried a note of irritation, as though the night's proceedings were beneath him. Constable Graves, for his part, seemed equally unenthused. He muttered darkly about how he wasn't about to let an elderly woman stumble into the hands of a real murderer, though it was clear from the way he glared at the darkness that he wasn't entirely convinced of Miss Marple's innocence in this matter. Miss Marple, however, paid little attention to their complaints. Her eyes remained fixed on the fog-shrouded street before them, her mind racing through every possibility. The village seemed eerily silent, its usual bustle conspicuously absent. The gas lamps flickered faintly in the distance, casting long shadows that only deepened the feeling of suspense that hung thick in the air. She could sense it, something was about to happen, and it was only a matter of time before the next piece of the puzzle fell into place. St. Mary Me had always been a village of secrets, its history steeped in long-buried grudges and whispered gossip. But now those secrets were clawing their way to the surface, threatening to consume everyone in their path. The quiet, seemingly tranquil life of the villagers was now shattered, replaced by an undercurrent of fear and suspicion. As the minutes ticked by, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the killer. They were playing a game, she realized, a dark game with deadly stakes. The next move was imminent, and Miss Marple would not let it go unanswered. She would stop the murderer before the final verse was played. She had seen it before, how slowly, how insidiously, a predator could weave its web, how every moment could bring either salvation or doom. And now, as she stood in the shadows with Colonel Bantry and Constable Graves, she knew one thing for certain: the game was nearing its end, and only she could tip the scales. The night was thick with tension, the air so still it seemed as if the village itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple stood motionless, her keen eyes tracking every shift in the darkness, every movement just beyond the reach of the dim streetlights. Beside her, Colonel Bantry shuffled uncomfortably, muttering about how much more pleasant this stakeout would be with a drink in hand, but Miss Marple's focus never wavered. "One can certainly wait with a brandy," she whispered patiently, her voice soft yet commanding, "but the true danger won't be inside the pub. We must remain here, where it will unfold." Bantry harumphed but offered no more complaints. Constable Graves, ever the skeptic, glanced at his pocket watch and sighed. "I still don't understand what makes you so sure, Miss Marple," he said, clearly annoyed by the lack of action. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, her eyes never leaving the vicarage door. "We are following a pattern," she murmured, "and the murderer loves to make a show of things. The first two deaths were tied to disgrace, places soaked in their victims' failures. The vicarage, as you may recall, was where Rert Abbott's life was tragically undone." Graves scowled, skepticism etched on his face. "That was over 40 years ago," he said, but Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely audible, "but old wounds have a way of festering, don't they?" Silence fell over them once more, the weight of history settling heavily on their shoulders. The village felt empty, too quiet, as if it were bracing for something unspeakable. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the vicarage door, then to the narrow garden gate, her gaze unwavering. The shutters on the windows seemed to close the house off from the world, and yet there was something terribly alive in the stillness, A slight rustling broke the silence, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple caught it at once, her senses sharp as ever. Colonel Bantry stiffened beside her, and Graves, ever alert, motioned for them to remain quiet, his hand instinctively going to the truncheon at his side. Another sound, this time a creak, faint but unmistakable, came from the vicarage. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The three of them stood frozen, as though the night itself was watching them. Then a sudden sharp clatter, the unmistakable sound of something heavy being knocked over inside the house. Graves cursed softly under his breath. "That's it. I'm going in." "No," Miss Marple said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Both men hesitated, but she held them back with a gesture. The night, once so heavy with silence, now crackled with electricity. Time seemed to stretch impossibly long before a figure emerged from the shadows. Just a flicker at first, barely visible against the inky dark, a tall, slender silhouette slipping through the side gate of the vicarage, with the careful precision of someone determined not to be seen. Miss Marple inhaled deeply. The murderer had arrived, and she was ready. As the shadowed figure moved deeper into the garden, the tension in the air grew thicker, a storm waiting to break. Constable Graves, always eager to act, shifted forward, ready to intervene, but Miss Marple was faster. Her hand, surprisingly firm for someone of her years, closed around his arm, holding him back. "Wait, Henry," she murmured, her voice steady, her eyes locked on the figure now disappearing into the darkness. For a moment it seemed as if nothing would happen. The village remained as still as ever, but then, there it was. A sudden noise, a thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing to the ground. Bantry swore under his breath. "That's it. I'm..." Before he could finish, the side door of the vicarage burst open, and a figure dashed out into the moonlight, their coat flaring behind them like a shadow in flight. "Stop!" Graves shouted, his voice urgent, but the figure did not slow. They ran fast and desperate. It was instinct, rather than calculation, that propelled Miss Marple forward, her feet quick and sure, despite the slippery cobblestones. She didn't need to chase, she only needed to observe. As the figure disappeared down the lane, she caught a glimpse of something small falling to the ground in their wake, a single slip of paper, torn fluttering in the breeze. Miss Marple reached it first, stooping to pluck it from the ground. The note was hastily written, the ink smudged, as if the writer had been in a great hurry. She turned it over, and for a brief moment, her breath caught. The final line of the nursery rhyme was there, written with deliberate intent. An N was seen again. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the note, her mind already racing. The game was afoot, and this time, there would be no stopping it. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the slip of paper, as the room around her swirled into oblivion. The others, Bantry and Graves, argued heatedly, their voices too distant for her to comprehend. Her mind, sharp and focused, had already outpaced them, unraveling the final strands of a pattern that had stretched across time. This was no mere clue. No, it was a warning, a harbinger of the final, inevitable act that was about to unfold. She could feel it in her bones. If she did not act immediately, someone in St. Mary Mead would vanish, this time for good. Standing abruptly, her expression unreadable, she turned toward the others, her voice cutting through their dissonance like a knife. "We have no time to waste," she said, her words clipped, each syllable thick with urgency. "We must move now." The room in the Bantry house, bathed in the soft crackling glow of the fire, was a strange juxtaposition of warmth and tension. The air, scented with lavender and the faint trace of pipe smoke, clung to the heavy curtains and polished furniture, but beneath it all was a palpable unease, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Miss Marple, ever the picture of composure, sat in her usual place, her delicate fingers resting on a teacup she had yet to lift. The others around her fidgeted, their discomfort unmistakable. Dolly Bantry, with her wide, eager eyes, looked like she was ready for something to happen, her anxiety barely concealed. Colonel Bantry, ever the military man, wore an expression of deep patience that veiled the tension beneath. Across from them Dr. Ellsworth, the village physician, sat with his hands drumming on his knee, his mind likely tracing connections between the two victims he had attended, his calm exterior hiding an underlying storm of unspoken questions. Reverend Milton, the mild-mannered priest, sat stiffly beside him, his thoughts seemingly far away. But Miss Marple knew better. She could feel the weight of his memories pressing on him, especially the one from the vicarage where Rupert Abbott's disgrace had unfolded. Then there was Edith Phelps, her lips tightly pursed in disapproval, but Miss Marple could see the flicker of curiosity in her eyes, betraying her true feelings. Finally, Henry Graves, the constable, stood nearest the door, his arms crossed, his gaze piercing, caught between duty and frustration. The silence in the room stretched, the tension building as Miss Marple's eyes swept over each person, reading their every shift and flicker of recognition. She let the moment linger, savoring the discomfort, before breaking it with a smile as small as it was knowing. "I'm sure you all have realized by now," she began, her voice light yet edged with the weight of her words, "we are not dealing with ordinary murders." A ripple of movement, a shift of weight, and a few cautious glances followed her words. "This is not the work of a madman," she continued, her eyes locking onto Edith. "It's a game, an elaborate performance, and the nursery rhyme is the key." The room seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple recited the familiar lines, and when she spoke them aloud, "The King of Hearts, he made a tart, and so they stole it plain." The words settled like a heavy fog over the gathering. Edith, her lips trembling slightly, murmured, "The Queen she wept, the knave he fled, and N was seen again." The rhyme lingered in the air, as innocuous as a child's bedtime verse, but now revealed as something far darker, something that bound these deaths together in a pattern of meticulous design. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes sharp, her mind already piecing together the final, devastating clues. The game was reaching its crescendo, and St. Mary Mead was about to face its final act. The stolen tart, the grieving queen, the fleeing knave, each line of the nursery rhyme had played out with eerie precision, and now, Miss Marple's voice cut through the tension in the room. "We are nearing the final act," she said, her tone steady, her gaze sharp. Reverend Milton shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Are you suggesting the murderer is following this pattern deliberately?" he asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Miss Marple's reply was simple, yet heavy with implication, "I am." The weight of her words hung in the air, drawing a ripple of unease through the room. She paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch before continuing. "When one follows such a pattern, one must ask who is playing what role." Dr. Ellsworth, the village physician, cleared his throat, his voice betraying a hint of doubt. "But what does it mean? A rhyme is just a rhyme, isn't it?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed as she answered, her tone now edged with something darker. "Not when it is a metaphor. The rhyme is a symbol, a map of this crime, and to understand it, we must look to the past." Her gaze swept over the room, every face, every twitch of the eyes, as she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter Abbott was disgraced, a scandal buried, a young woman's life ruined. And yet someone did not forget. The room seemed to tighten, as Miss Marple's words fell like stones into a quiet pond. "Peter Abbott," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "was the King of Hearts. The heir to a tarnished name, and the price to be paid for his father's misdeeds. Iris Henderson, the grieving queen, not a literal queen of course, but a woman left behind, bearing the weight of what was stolen from her." She paused, letting her gaze linger on Reverend Milton, whose face had drained of color. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes piercing. "You don't mean—" the words trailed off, but Miss Marple's reply was unwavering. "Oh, but I do. Sarah Pembroke, the woman whose life was destroyed by Peter Abbott's betrayal. She was sent away, cast aside, her name erased, and yet we do not know what became of her. A chill settled over the room as Edith Phelps stirred, her voice barely a whisper. "There were rumors," she began, but Miss Marple cut her off, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "Indeed," she said. "And if she had a child born of scandal, raised in the shadow of a mother's grief, a child who spent years nursing an inherited wound, shaping their very identity around an injustice never made right, a child who returned to St. Mary Mead, intent on settling the score." Miss Marple's hands clenched on the arms of her chair as she let the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. "And that brings us to the final line of the rhyme. The knave who fled, and N was seen again." The room seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple rose slowly to her feet, her presence commanding silence. "The final murder," she said, her voice firm but soft, "will not be an act of vengeance, but an act of escape." Dr. Ellsworth frowned, his brow furrowing. "Escape?" Miss Marple nodded, the realization dawning on her. The murderer has been reenacting this rhyme step by step. If they are following the pattern precisely, then the last act will not be a killing, it will be a disappearance. The weight of her words settled slowly over the room, and the reality of it began to sink in. The murderer wasn't planning to strike again, they were planning to vanish, which means, Miss Marple continued, rising to her feet, her voice gaining strength, "we are not searching for a murderer preparing to strike again. We are searching for someone who is about to disappear." The grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight, the sound echoing ominously through the stillness of the room. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze sharp as she surveyed the faces of those around her. They had very little time left. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting the room in shadows, but the tension in the air was palpable, thick with the knowledge that time was running out. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap, her composure unwavering. "We are dealing," she began, her voice calm but filled with quiet authority, "with a crime that was never meant to be solved." The murders had not been random acts of violence. No, they were carefully staged performances, each clue a calculated reference to a past injustice. "Peter Abbott," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, was the first. He represented the King of Hearts, the one who made a tart. She glanced at the others, ensuring they were following her. "A tart, as you may recall, was stolen in the nursery rhyme, a metaphor, I believe, for something much darker." She let the words linger, her eyes piercing through the tension in the room, watching as the pieces began to fall into place. The room, thick with the shadows of the past and the weight of unsolved secrets, seemed to tighten around those gathered within it. The fires crackled softly in the hearth, but the stillness was unsettling, each flicker of light casting fleeting shadows that danced across the faces of the assembled group. Miss Marple, ever composed and keen-eyed, had laid out the pieces of the puzzle with chilling precision, and as her words reverberated through the heavy air, it was clear that a storm was brewing. Dr. Ellsworth shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his voice shaking with disbelief as he spoke. "You believe this refers to Rupert Abbott?" Miss Marple's response was calm, but her eyes were sharp, focused. "Indeed, the Abbott name has long been tied to scandal, most notably the mysterious disappearance of the church funds, but I believe the true theft was not money at all. The true tart that was stolen was Sarah Pembroke's future." Her words sliced through the thick tension, each syllable a piece of the puzzle snapping into place. A collective murmur filled the room, but Miss Marple continued, her voice steady, unwavering. "Sarah Pembroke, a woman ruined by Rupert Abbott, cast aside in disgrace. The village, preferring to erase the ugly truth, allowed her name to slip into obscurity. But," she let the word hang in the air, heavy with implication, "someone did not forget." Dolly Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in horror, the truth dawning on her like a shroud of darkness. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her words were as sharp as ever. "The child," she said simply, and the room fell silent, as if time itself had paused to allow the weight of her revelation to sink in. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, each second like an eternity, before continuing. "Precisely," she murmured. "The child, the offspring of a stolen future, a life irrevocably altered by betrayal." Her voice became softer, almost reverent. "Now we come to the second victim, an unassuming widow, a woman who lived alone, keeping to herself. She was murdered on the anniversary of Sarah Pembroke's disappearance, and upon her lifeless form a white lily was placed." Edith Phelps, sitting near the edge of her chair, muttered under her breath, "A symbol of mourning." Miss Marple gave a faint, almost sad smile, acknowledging the hidden meaning behind the gesture. "A grieving queen," she said, her voice heavy with understanding. "The queen who wept for what had been lost, for what could never be regained." Colonel Bantry, his brow furrowed with confusion, cleared his throat, asking what everyone else had been thinking. "But why Iris Henderson? What does she have to do with all of this?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, a shadow passing over her usually serene face. "Ah, Arthur, this is where human nature comes into play," she replied, her voice colder now, as if the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with unsettling clarity. Iris Henderson was no innocent bystander. She knew the truth about Sarah Pembroke's fate, and yet she chose to remain silent, to shield herself from the consequences of that knowledge. She lived with her secret, knowing the pain it caused, and for that she too was marked. Dolly Bantry whispered, her voice barely audible, "And now we come to the last part of the rhyme." Miss Marple nodded solemnly, her gaze fixed ahead, as if she could already see the final chapter unfolding. "Yes, the knave who fled, and N was seen again." A thick silence filled the room, heavier than any spoken word. Henry Graves, his face pale, was the first to break it, his voice taut with anxiety. "So the killer, whoever they are, is planning to disappear." Miss Marple met his gaze, her eyes sharp as a blade. "Yes, and I believe they have planned it meticulously," she said, her voice low, almost reverent in its certainty. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small scrap of paper, the one found during the late-night stakeout. Holding it up for everyone to see, she said, "This note, dropped by the person we are looking for, was left at the vicarage last night. They were tying up loose ends before vanishing, making sure no trace remained." The room seemed to exhale, the tension almost palpable as Miss Marple turned the scrap of paper over in her hands and read aloud the chilling final line. "And N was seen again." A cold shiver swept through the room. The meaning of those words settled over them all like a winter frost. Miss Marple's voice cut through the silence, clear and resolute. "This is the final step in their plan. If we do not act swiftly, the murderer will slip away, just as the rhyme dictates." Dr. Ellsworth, his face drained of color, barely whispered, "But who is it, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple allowed herself a small knowing smile, the slightest curve of her lips, before rising slowly to her feet. Her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of one who has long known the truth. "My dear doctor," she said, her voice rich with quiet confidence, "I have known the answer for quite some time, and if we move quickly, we can still prevent the final act from being completed." She turned toward the door, and without a second glance at the room, she began to walk. The others, almost in unison, followed her lead, their footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. "We have a murderer to catch." The Bantry drawing room, once filled with the faint crackling of the fire and the ticking of the grand clock, now felt stifling, the air thick with anticipation. Outside, the village remained blissfully unaware, asleep in its quiet ignorance, while within these walls, the final act of a sinister drama was unfolding. Miss Marple stood poised at the center of the room, an unassuming figure whose calm exterior masked the sharp mind beneath. Her gaze swept over the assembled group, her expression gentle, but her eyes, those eyes were a mirror of steel, unyielding and resolute. The moment of revelation had arrived. "We have followed a pattern," she began, her voice steady, yet filled with a quiet force. A game played with deadly precision. 2 murders, each mirroring the lines of an old nursery rhyme. Peter Abbott, the king; Iris Henderson, the queen. The room held its collective breath, the last piece of the puzzle finally falling into place, as Miss Marple's words echoed in the stillness, sealing the fate of the killer who would soon vanish into the night. The room hung heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, its very walls seemingly pressed to the brink of cracking under the tension that simmered like a storm on the horizon. The fire in the hearth, once bright and warm, now flickered faintly, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed against the polished mahogany paneling. The scent of burning wood mingled with the cold, stale air of secrets long buried. Miss Marple, the picture of calm composure, her hands folded delicately in her lap, allowed her words to settle like a fine dust, each syllable dripping with the promise of revelation. "The crime of vengeance, rooted in the past," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge of something deeper, darker. A pause followed, heavy and suffocating. "And now the final act, the knave, who fled and was never seen again." A flicker of movement in the room caught her attention, so subtle, almost imperceptible, that it could have easily been missed by anyone else. But not Miss Marple. Her eyes, sharp as the edge of a blade, narrowed slightly, watching with a knowing gaze. She could sense the shift, the tightening of muscles, the barely concealed discomfort. Dr. Ellsworth, who had been eerily quiet throughout the gathering, shifted in his chair, his posture stiffening, though he did his best to mask the unease. Miss Marple, never one to be distracted by such small things, pressed on, her voice unwavering. "Who among us," she said, her eyes now locking with his, "has been playing this dreadful game?" The question hung in the air, thick with implication. The truth, as it often does, was hiding in the smallest of details, and Miss Marple was a master of finding them, even when they were so carefully concealed. Her gaze turned to Dr. Ellsworth, who for the first time that evening, seemed unnervingly still, as though the weight of her scrutiny had pierced through his carefully constructed facade. "It was you, wasn't it, Doctor?" she asked, the question soft, but deadly. A sharp intake of breath escaped from the others in the room, but Miss Marple's eyes never left him. Dr. Ellsworth's reaction was immediate. His body went rigid, his face draining of color, his mouth opening as though to protest, but the words never came. Instead, his hands gripped the armrests of his chair, with a strength that threatened to break the wood. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice forced, though the tremor in his tone was impossible to disguise, "this is a very serious accusation." She nodded gently, her gaze softening only slightly, the steel beneath it unmistakable. "Oh yes, Doctor, very serious indeed." A ripple of unease spread through the room, but Miss Marple remained unmoved, like a stone in a river's current. She turned toward the others, her voice steady, but filled with a quiet intensity. "Dr. Ellsworth came to St. Mary nearly a decade ago, respectable, well-mannered, trusted. But what few people knew was that his mother was a woman named Sarah Pembroke." The revelation struck like a thunderclap, a collective gasp rising from the group. Dr. Ellsworth's knuckles whitened as he clenched his hands tighter on the armrests, his jaw set in an almost imperceptible grind. But Miss Marple, ever the observer, saw it all, the faint tremor in his hands, the quick flash of guilt that crossed his face before he could school it into neutrality. "You were born in secrecy, Doctor," she continued, her voice gentle now, almost sympathetic, but her words sliced through him like a blade. "Sent away with your mother when she was cast out of this village. I imagine you grew up with the knowledge of what had been done to her, of the man who had ruined her life and vanished without consequence. And I imagine that knowledge festered, eating away at you for years." Dr. Ellsworth exhaled slowly, but he said nothing. His gaze, however, flickered just for a moment, a tiny fleeting moment, but Miss Marple saw it. "For years you waited," she pressed on, stepping closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. "And when the moment came, when you found yourself back in this village, you saw your chance to rewrite history." She let the words linger, heavy with meaning. You chose Peter Abbott first, because his father was the source of your mother's ruin. Then Iris Henderson, because she had known and yet had remained silent. At this Dr. Ellsworth's eyes flickered once more, but Miss Marple had seen enough. Her lips curved in the faintest of smiles, knowing but tinged with sadness. "But you made a mistake, Doctor," she said, her voice lowering, almost to a whisper. A small one, but significant. She reached into her handbag, the movement deliberate, and withdrew the crumpled slip of paper they had found the night before at the vicarage. "You left a note behind when you fled, Doctor," she said, her eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. "And in your haste, you used the very ink and stationery that can be found in your own medical office." A sharp silence followed, thick with the weight of her words. Dr. Ellsworth's mask cracked then, the carefully constructed facade crumbling like old stone. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the tension palpable as everyone watched the doctor's response. Dolly Bantry exhaled slowly, her hand fluttering to her chest, as if the revelation had knocked the breath from her. Colonel Bantry, his face pale, muttered under his breath, "Good Lord." Dr. Ellsworth's jaw tightened for a moment, his gaze flickering from Miss Marple to the others. For a moment it seemed as though he might protest, might deny it all, but then, as if a great weight had been lifted from him, he slumped back in his chair, exhaling a long weary sigh. A small, almost rueful smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Well," he said, his voice tinged with resignation, "I suppose there's no sense in denying it now, is there?" Miss Marple gave a small sad nod, her face softening slightly. "No," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "there is not." The game was over, and the knave had been caught before he could flee. The Bantry drawing room, once a place of genteel conversation and idle chatter, now felt like a chamber of secrets, every corner heavy with the truth that had been revealed. The fire burned low, its embers glowing softly in the hearth, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward the corners of the room. The heavy velvet drapes muffled the sounds of the village beyond, the world outside oblivious to the storm that had just broken within these walls. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken wariness, as though the weight of all the hidden lives, the broken promises and the long-held secrets had finally caught up with them. Miss Marple, seated primly in her usual chair, surveyed the room with the calm composure of a woman who had seen it all before. Her delicate hands rested lightly on the armrests, her posture the picture of quiet authority. Yet, despite the serenity of her exterior, her gaze was sharp, like a hawk's eyeing its prey, unwavering and precise. Around her, the key players in this deadly game were seated. Dolly Bantry, her fingers twitching nervously against the embroidery of her lap. Colonel Bantry, his back stiff and his eyes distant as though he were lost in a sea of regret. The final act had been played, and the truth was now laid bare. The killer, the knave who had once fled, would never escape again. Dr. Ellsworth sat with his arms tightly crossed, his posture rigid, as if preparing for something he knew would come. His eyes darted nervously toward the door, a look of quiet desperation creeping across his face as though he had already planned his exit. Reverend Milton, pale and grim, sat nearby, his hands tightly clasped in a silent prayer, his demeanor almost like a man condemned. Henry Graves, the village constable, stood beside the fireplace, his expression one of utter discomfort, his gaze darting about as though he longed for a way out of this charged atmosphere. Edith Phelps, ever the watchful observer, sat with a stillness that spoke of deep calculation, her lips drawn tight and her fingers pressed so firmly together that the skin had paled to an almost ghostly white. The room was suffocatingly silent, each individual seemingly caught in their own thoughts, until Miss Marple, with a soft but deliberate sigh, broke the tension. She adjusted the lace cuffs of her sleeves, her eyes calmly sweeping the room as she prepared to speak, her voice clear and steady. "It is never as simple as it seems," she said, her tone gentle but resolute. Dr. Ellsworth let out a sharp exhale, as though dismissing her words before they were even fully spoken. "I should think it is quite simple, Miss Marple. The police have the man," he said, his voice firm. Miss Marple turned toward him with a small knowing smile. "Do they, Doctor?" she asked, the flicker of hesitation in his eyes betraying his confidence. Her voice remained calm as she continued, folding her hands in her lap, her eyes locked on him. "2 deaths, both carefully staged. A playing card, a white lily, symbols chosen with the utmost precision, a deliberate reenactment of a nursery rhyme that speaks of betrayal and justice." Her words echoed in the room, each one building the tension as they hung in the air. "This crime," she continued, "is not an isolated event, but rather a reenactment of a crime long past." Colonel Bantry cleared his throat, his voice breaking through the thick silence. "We all know the rhyme now, Jane, and we all know you've found the pattern, the King of Hearts, the one who made the tart, the Queen, the one who wept, and now the Knave, the one who must flee." Miss Marple's smile did not falter, her fingers curling slightly over the arm of her chair. "Yes," she said, her voice unwavering, "and this is where we find ourselves now, isn't it? The murderer, having exacted their revenge, now intends to disappear just as the rhyme dictates." The room shifted uneasily, but Miss Marple continued, her tone never faltering, the quiet authority in her voice undeniable. "One must consider the method, the precision, the patience. It must have taken years to carefully plan each step. Such a crime is not born of haste or impulse," she said, her eyes narrowing as they focused on Dr. Ellsworth. "No," she added softly, "it was written in ink long before it was written in blood." A profound silence descended over the group, their breath held as the weight of her words sank in. Dolly Bantry, her voice barely above a whisper, finally spoke. "But how?" Miss Marple turned toward the others, her tone thoughtful, almost sympathetic. "Dr. Ellsworth has been our trusted physician for many years, the very man who pronounced both victims dead. The man who, by his very profession, understands the delicate balance between life and death better than anyone." She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving him. "And yet," she said, with a slight tilt of her head, "he failed to consider one crucial thing." Dr. Ellsworth's jaw tightened, but his lips remained sealed. Miss Marple reached into her handbag, her fingers steady as she withdrew a second playing card, a jack of spades. "This," she said, softly, turning the card over to reveal the words, and then was seen again. The room fell silent once more, the gravity of the moment pressing down on all of them. Miss Marple observed the doctor with a look of almost sorrowful pity. "You were planning to stage your own disappearance, weren't you, Doctor?" she asked, her voice gentle but piercing. "A tragic accident, perhaps. A body found in the river, a body that would never be found." Dr. Ellsworth's face drained of color, his composure faltering for the first time. Graves stepped forward instinctively, his hand resting on the truncheon at his side, his posture ready to spring into action. But Dr. Ellsworth did not flee. Instead, after what seemed like an eternity, he let out a slow, controlled breath, his shoulders slumping as he leaned back into his chair. "Well," he murmured, "that's rather clever, isn't it?" Miss Marple regarded him with a soft, almost pitying smile. "Clever perhaps," she said quietly, "but doomed to fail." She paused, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that sent a chill through the room. "You see, Doctor," she continued, "there is one thing no criminal ever accounts for." Dr. Ellsworth raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "And what is that?" he asked, his voice low, the faintest hint of unease creeping in. Miss Marple smiled, the faintest trace of triumph in her expression. "Human nature," she said simply, and in that moment it was as though the entire room exhaled in unison, the tension breaking like a dam finally giving way. The game was over. The murderer, once so confident in their plans, had been undone by the very nature they thought they could control. The tension in the room was suffocating, an invisible force that wrapped itself around each person like an unrelenting vice. Ellsworth, his calm demeanor cracking under the weight of Miss Marple's accusation, sat motionless, his fingers absently tracing invisible patterns on the polished arm of his chair. His eyes, once detached and clinical, now darted nervously around the room, betraying a growing unease. The fire in the hearth crackled, its rhythmic popping the only sound breaking the suffocating silence, as if the very room itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple, serene as ever, sat with her hands delicately resting in her lap, her gaze unwavering and sharp. Beneath her composed exterior, however, was a mind calculating every movement, every shift in the air. She had seen this before, the slow unraveling of a man confronted with the undeniable weight of his own guilt. For a long agonizing moment, Dr. Ellsworth said nothing. His face, usually so composed, now flickered with the shadows of a truth too dark to acknowledge. The silence seemed to stretch forever until Colonel Bantry, his patience fraying, exhaled sharply. "Come now, Doctor, say something," he urged, his voice a rough plea for answers. "Doctor," Ellsworth let out a bitter chuckle, hollow and edged with a strange relief. "What would you have me say?" he murmured, almost to himself. "That I'm sorry, that I regret what I've done." Dolly Bantry leaned forward, her eyes wide, her breath held. "Do you?" she asked. Ellsworth turned toward her, his expression unreadable, and in a low voice he asked, "Would it matter if I did?" Miss Marple's gaze softened, her head tilting ever so slightly. "It would matter a great deal, Doctor," she said, her tone calm but firm. A long pause settled between them before Ellsworth finally spoke, his voice quiet yet laden with years of suppressed emotion. "Do you know," he began almost conversationally, "how long I have waited for this moment?" His eyes scanned the room, lingering on Miss Marple, then sweeping over the others. Graves, the Bantrys, Reverend Milton, Edith Phelps. "All of you," he murmured, "sitting here in this warm, comfortable room, talking of justice and right and wrong. But none of you were there. None of you saw what was done." Reverend Milton shifted uneasily, but Ellsworth's gaze remained fixed on him. "My mother," he continued, his voice cold as ice, was destroyed. "Do you understand that? She was ruined." A heavy silence fell over the room. "I grew up with her stories," he went on, his voice lower now, filled with barely contained fury. "The whispered disgrace, the people who turned their backs, the shame she bore, and all the while Peter Abbott lived comfortably in London, never answering for what he had done. His family never suffered, no consequences, not a single one." Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. "And so you waited," she said quietly. Ellsworth's breath caught in his throat, and he let out a breathless laugh, bitter and hollow. "Yes, Miss Marple, I waited. When I came here, when I became the trusted village doctor, I watched, I listened, and when the time came, I made sure the sins of the past were finally repaid." His voice grew quieter still. "Peter Abbott first, the son of a thief, made to answer for his father's crimes." A murmur ran through the room, but no one dared interrupt. "Iris Henderson," he continued, his jaw tightening, she knew what had been done, and she said nothing, lived her life in peace while my mother lived hers in shadows." Miss Marple studied him closely, her eyes never leaving his face. "And you would have vanished," she said, almost as if it were a statement of fact. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "It was never about me," he replied softly. "It was about them. The past demanded justice, and I gave it." The room was still, the weight of his words pressing down on them all. Then, unexpectedly, he let out a tired, hollow laugh. "Oh, how foolish," he murmured. "How poetic. I thought it was all a story, a grand tale played out to its final note. And yet here I am." He shook his head, the realization settling over him. "Not nearly as clever as I had imagined." Miss Marple's lips curled into a small knowing smile, her eyes glinting with quiet wisdom. "Oh, but that's where you are wrong, Doctor," she said softly. Ellsworth lifted an eyebrow, a challenge in his gaze. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, and leaned forward slightly. "You were very clever, Doctor," she said, "but cleverness, you see, is not the same as wisdom. This version maintains the same tense atmospheric tone and flow, but introduces further psychological depth and emotional conflict, building on Dr. Ellsworth's motivations and his gradual unraveling. The suspense is heightened with the slow, deliberate reveal of his inner turmoil and the psychological burden of his actions, making the story even more engaging and mysterious. The heavy silence in the room settled like a thick fog, pressing against every person gathered, wrapping them in its cold, oppressive weight. The fire in the hearth crackled, sending brief flickers of warmth through the air, but it did little to cut through the chill that had taken over the room. Dr. Ellsworth sat motionless in his chair, his face pale, his body rigid with the realization that the game was over. Every carefully laid plan, every step he'd taken to orchestrate his revenge, had crumbled. He had reached the final note in his self-composed symphony, only to realize that the last act had been beyond his control. A small chuckle escaped his lips, but it was a hollow sound, full of defeat. His mind, however, still raced, still clung to the fragments of a life he thought he could shape to his will. Henry Graves, standing at the edge of the room with an expression carved from stone, stepped forward. His heavy hand came down on Ellsworth's shoulder with a quiet finality. There was no resistance, there was no fight left in the man who had once believed that his intellect and cunning could outmaneuver fate itself. The final curtain had fallen, and the inevitability of what was to come pressed in on him. As Graves approached, producing a pair of handcuffs from his coat pocket, the room seemed to hold its breath. Ellsworth made no protest as the cold metal closed around his wrists, no frantic attempt to flee. There was nothing left to escape to. His eyes flickered briefly toward Miss Marple, who sat as composed as ever in her chair, her hands folded delicately in her lap, her expression inscrutable but filled with quiet understanding. The weight of her gaze seemed to pierce through him in a way that nothing else had. For a brief moment his mind scrambled for some excuse, some justification, but it was too late. His fate had been sealed long ago, and now there was nothing left to say. Ellsworth let out a breath, his voice thin and distant. "For years," he murmured, almost as if to himself, "I imagined how this would end." His eyes met Miss Marple's again, his expression unreadable, but there was something raw in his gaze, something vulnerable that had been hidden beneath layers of self-deception for far too long. "But I never thought it would be her who caught me." Miss Marple's response came slowly, each word deliberate, almost as if she were measuring it against the weight of the truth. "Murder," she said, her voice carrying the slightest trace of sorrow, "is an untidy thing, Doctor. No matter how carefully one plans it, it always unravels." Her words hung in the air, hanging like a dense fog, unspoken yet undeniable. The fire crackled again, the rhythmic popping sounding almost out of place in the otherwise still room, as if the flames themselves were reflecting the unspoken truth that had already taken root. Dolly Bantry, her wide eyes locked onto the scene before her, shook her head in disbelief. "All these years," she whispered to her husband, her voice trembling, tending to people's ailments, and yet, her words trailed off, too stunned to continue, too overwhelmed to comprehend how her own trusted village doctor had been the architect of such a terrible crime. Colonel Bantry, ever the realist, gave a soft grunt, his gaze unyielding. "A bit of a shock," he muttered, "but I suspect Jane had it worked out days ago." Miss Marple's smile, though small, was knowing. She had already seen through the layers of deception, understood the motivations long before the final confession. Dr. Ellsworth's eyes shifted back to her once more, his expression a mixture of admiration and quiet desperation. "Tell me, Miss Marple," he asked, his voice low and thick with a quiet anguish, "if I had been just a little less careful, left out the playing card, or the lily, do you think I might have gotten away with it?" His question, laced with a mix of regret and curiosity, seemed to linger in the air as he waited for her response. He had spent so many years perfecting the details of his plan, so many nights envisioning this final act, but now that the moment had arrived, he found himself asking if perhaps the smallest mistake had cost him everything. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her gaze searching, assessing, as though weighing the depth of his question. She let the silence stretch between them, as if considering his words before speaking. Finally, she responded, her voice calm but resolute. "Perhaps," she said, "but murder is not easily forgotten, Doctor. People remember things, small things, an overheard remark, a misplaced object, a glance exchanged at the wrong moment, and in the end, those little things have a way of adding up." Her words, though simple, carried a weight that seemed to settle over the room. She folded her hands in her lap, and as she spoke, her expression softened, but there was a trace of finality in her voice. "You may have followed your nursery rhyme to its end," she continued, her tone thoughtful, "but a nursery rhyme is only a story, and stories don't account for real people. Real people have a way of interfering." Ellsworth's laugh was bitter and resigned, the last vestige of his bravado slipping away like sand through his fingers. "Indeed," he whispered, his voice empty, the finality of his words weighing heavily on the room. "Indeed they do." The handcuffs clinked as Graves nudged him toward the door, his movements methodical, yet somehow reluctant, as though even he felt the magnitude of what had just transpired. As Ellsworth was led away, the tension in the room began to lift, but an unsettling sense of heaviness lingered. The knowledge that such a deep-rooted crime had existed within their midst, carefully hidden, carefully nurtured, was not easily shaken. The fire crackled again, but its warmth felt hollow, inadequate in the face of the darkness that had been unearthed. Reverend Milton sighed deeply, his hand rubbing over his face in weariness, the burden of the moment settling heavily upon him. "It's a terrible thing," he murmured, his voice low and full of sorrow. "How grief and resentment can linger, how a crime so old could still cause death after all these years." Miss Marple, ever calm and composed, regarded him with quiet understanding. "Yes, Reverend," she replied softly, "it is a terrible thing indeed. The past does not always stay buried, especially when there is someone determined to dig it up." Her words, though gentle, carried an unspoken truth. The past, it seemed, would always find its way back to the surface, no matter how carefully it was buried. Dolly Bantry leaned forward, her voice a whisper, her eyes still wide with disbelief. "Do you think he regretted it?" she asked, her gaze searching Miss Marple's face for some hint of an answer. Miss Marple sighed, a faint trace of sadness in her expression, and after a pause she spoke again. "Perhaps, in the end," she said, her voice soft but filled with the weight of experience. "But regret, Dolly, is a curious thing. Some feel it before they act, others only after they have been caught." Dolly shivered slightly at the thought, her mind struggling to come to terms with the chilling truth of the situation. "A rather chilling thought," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Miss Marple's smile, though small, carried a trace of wistfulness. "Yes, dear," she replied softly. "But then again, it is always easier to see the consequences of our actions once we are no longer in control." "Murder," Miss Marple murmured softly, her knitting needles clicking with methodical precision as she pulled the yarn taut, her fingers moving with the practiced grace of someone who had seen the world for what it truly was. The soft chime of the village clock rang out, its rhythmic toll carrying through the quiet air of St. Mary Mead. Life, it seemed, would return to its familiar pace, tea would be poured, gardens meticulously tended, and gossip would find its way from one corner of the village to the next. But beneath the surface of the familiar, something had irrevocably shifted. The village had been altered, not by any grand or obvious gesture, but by the subtle intrusion of something darker, something that had been allowed to simmer and fester for years, only to now rise to the surface. Though the hedgerows remained neatly trimmed and the postman dutifully made his daily rounds, something intangible hung in the air. The morning mist, which stubbornly clung to the rooftops before evaporating beneath the pale autumn sun, no longer felt quite the same. It was as though a shadow lingered, unseen but deeply felt, in every whispered conversation, and every fleeting glance exchanged between neighbors. The village of St. Mary Mead, which had once felt so safe and secure, now seemed to carry an undercurrent of unease, as if it were a place haunted by its own past. The talk, as it always did, continued unabated. Mrs. Bartlett and Miss Harrel were to be found at the Bluebell Tea Room, speculating over cups of weak Earl Grey, mulling over the questions that had remained unanswered. Had Dr. Ellsworth ever truly planned to flee, or had Miss Marple simply outsmarted him before he could make his final move? At the greengrocer's, young Nancy had been overheard remarking that she always found the doctor's manner a bit too quiet, and had added, with an air of warning, that one should always be wary of a man who never took sugar in his tea. Meanwhile, at the Grange, Colonel and Dolly Bantry sat in their drawing-room, the fire flickering dimly as they discussed the matter with a seriousness that seemed out of place for them. Dolly, curled up in her favorite armchair, stirred her tea absently, her thoughts far away. "It's a peculiar thing, Arthur," she said softly, "to think we've lived alongside him all these years, and yet none of us ever suspected a thing." Colonel Bantry, his attention diverted only momentarily from the newspaper he had been reading, grunted, and looked at her over the top of his paper. "Well, of course we didn't suspect him, Dolly," he replied. "He was the doctor. People trust doctors, just like they trust the vicar and the police. No one ever thinks to question them." His voice held a trace of bitterness. "Damn clever of Miss Marple, though, I'll give her that." Dolly nodded, a faint frown creasing her brow. "It does make you think, doesn't it, Arthur?" She paused, her voice lowering almost to a whisper, as she continued, "About secrets. They never really go away, do they?" Colonel Bantry glanced up from his paper at her, an eyebrow raised. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Dolly let out a soft sigh, as though weighing her words carefully. "I mean, everyone in the village had all but forgotten about Sarah Pembroke and Rupert Abbott, hadn't they? But it didn't matter in the end. The past always catches up with us, whether we remember it or not." Arthur exhaled slowly, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I suppose that's true enough," he said, his voice distant. There was a long pause, the fire crackling in the background, casting a warm glow across the room. Dolly sat in silence, her thoughts turning over like the leaves in the garden outside. After a moment she spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost uncertain. "Do you think it was justice, Arthur?" she asked, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that he had not expected. "What Dr. Ellsworth did, do you think it was justice? Or was it just revenge, dressed up as something righteous?" Arthur looked at her, startled by the question. For a moment he did not respond, his mind racing to grasp the full weight of what she had just asked. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he set his newspaper aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face thoughtful. "Justice is a fine thing in theory, Dolly," he said slowly, his voice laced with both frustration and resignation. "But sometimes it's hard to know if it was ever really about justice. People like Dr. Ellsworth, they're driven by something much deeper, something that's not so easily understood." His gaze hardened as he looked toward the fire. "Revenge, sometimes, wears a cloak of righteousness, and you can't always tell where one ends and the other begins. But in practice," Dolly said quietly, her voice tinged with a kind of reluctant wisdom, "it's never as neat as we'd like it to be." She watched as Arthur took another sip of his whiskey, the amber liquid swirling in his glass before he set it down with a soft clink. The weight of her words hung between them, the harsh truth that no matter how one justifies an action, murder remains murder, cold, irredeemable. "A man may convince himself that he's serving a greater good," Arthur murmured, "but in the end it's still a life taken, and that doesn't change." Dolly nodded slowly, her thoughts drifting to darker corners. "Yes," she replied softly, "I suppose that's the bitter part of justice, isn't it? It never quite feels as righteous as we hope it will." Arthur said nothing, but his quiet acknowledgement echoed in the dimly lit room. His fingers tightened around his glass, yet there was no solace to be found in the drink. The room, though filled with warmth from the fire, seemed colder now, charged with the invisible weight of their shared knowledge. Outside, life in St. Mary Mead resumed its slow rhythmic course. The butcher's boy whistled cheerfully as he made his rounds, a pair of children chased one another through the streets, their laughter bright and innocent. At the vicarage, Reverend Milton, unaware of the storm that had just passed through their peaceful village, prepared his Sunday sermon, one that would speak softly of redemption, of the healing touch of forgiveness, as though all was well again. The village had begun its return to normalcy, yet, deep down, it was clear, something was amiss. Some scars, even in the most seemingly peaceful places, never truly fade. In the comfort of her small tidy sitting room, Miss Marple sat before the fire, its flickering flames casting a warm glow over the lace doilies and well-worn books that lined the shelves. The familiar sounds of the village, the clatter of the milk cart, the low murmur of neighbors exchanging pleasantries, the occasional bark of a dog, drifted in through the open window. Life, as it always did, had resumed its usual rhythm, but for Miss Marple, something lingered. She reached for her knitting, her fingers moving automatically, though her mind was far from the simple task at hand. The case, the murders, the secrets that had slowly unraveled, though now behind her, they refused to be forgotten. They were woven into the fabric of human nature, a theme that she had spent her life studying. Miss Marple had never been one for melodrama. Murder, despite its often sensational appearance in novels, was rarely about grand passions. No, it was simpler than that: greed, fear, resentment, and the frailty of love, whether betrayed, denied, or misplaced. Dr. Ellsworth's crime had not been born of sudden rage nor reckless ambition. It had been slow, calculated, a long brewing storm formed from years of quiet resentment, fanned by the ghosts of a past that could never be outrun. She let out a small sigh, setting down her knitting. The past, she mused, was a curious thing. One could bury it, ignore it, even pretend it held no power, but sooner or later, it always found its way to the surface, demanding acknowledgement. She had seen it before. Time and again, the carefully maintained respectability of the village could not hide the truths buried beneath it. People lived their lives, making small, seemingly inconsequential decisions, never realizing that each choice was part of a greater unfolding pattern. The smallest details, the flutter of a card, the misremembered nursery rhyme, the brief hesitation in a voice, the flicker of emotion too quickly masked, those were the things that unraveled the greatest secrets. Miss Marple smiled to herself, the corner of her lips curling up in quiet satisfaction, for the truth, she knew, was never truly hidden. It simply waited, patient and still, for the right eyes to see it. As she reached for her cup of tea, her fingers brushed the china, and she took a small sip, the warmth of the tea offering a fleeting moment of comfort amidst the swirling thoughts in her mind. The case might be over, but its shadows, like the past itself, would never quite fade. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her fingers curling around the warm teacup, feeling the comforting heat seep into her palms. She took a careful sip, savoring the warmth, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, marking time in the otherwise still room. The quiet of her cottage, with its gentle creaks and the scent of wood smoke hanging in the air, was a solace that contrasted with the turmoil of the past weeks. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead stirred into its usual morning life, the first rays of dawn spilling across the cobbled streets like a thin wash of pale gold, illuminating the sleepy village in a soft glow. Mist clung to the edges of the hedgerows, curling lazily into the cool air, as though the earth itself was reluctant to let go of the lingering night. For a moment it seemed as though the world might be as it had always been. The gentle hum of village life, the slow ebb and flow of its rhythms, seemed to carry on undisturbed. But beneath that still surface, something had changed, an undercurrent of unease, a subtle shift in the very fabric of the community, could not be ignored. The past weeks had left their mark, carving into the village's quiet facade like deep, invisible scars. The shadow of the murders, while no longer as sharp as it had been, still lingered, faint but undeniable. It hung in the air, in the hushed conversations and the guarded glances exchanged in the streets. Even in the grocer's shop, where Mrs. Bartlett and Miss Harnell continued their animated discussion, the words they spoke about village affairs were laced with something more. Their voices rose and fell, punctuated by scandalized gasps and dramatic pauses, but the undercurrent of secrets remained, flowing just beneath their chatter. They talked of the day-to-day, of the weather and the latest happenings, but each sentence was weighed down by the invisible burden of all that had been uncovered in the last few days. At the churchyard, Reverend Milton stood quietly with a few parishioners, his sermon about redemption and the long reach of past deeds still echoing in the air, his voice a soft murmur that blended with the rustling leaves and the distant hum of village life. His words, thoughtful and soothing, carried an air of comfort, but Miss Marple could not help but feel that they lacked the true substance that the village so desperately needed. The gentle balm of religion was soothing, but it could not erase the sharp truths that had been exposed. And in the Bluebell tea room, young Nancy, her bright eyes alight with youthful eagerness, carried a tray of freshly baked scones to the table where Dolly Bantry sat with Edith Phelps. Their conversation, ostensibly about the village's latest developments, was more than mere gossip. It was a quiet examination of the changes that had come to St. Mary Mead, a careful picking apart of the threads of what had happened. The voices of the two women were low, their words barely rising above the hum of the tea room, but there was something in the way they exchanged glances, something in the way the words faltered just before they reached the tip of their tongues, that spoke more of speculation than resolution. As the village tried, with all its might, to return to its familiar rhythm, Miss Marple, in the quiet solitude of her cottage, observed it all from her window. The mist slowly began to lift, revealing the everyday scenes of life, the milk cart rumbling down the street, the clatter of a dog barking in the distance, the murmur of neighbors exchanging pleasantries. Yet Miss Marple knew that the village was not the same. The subtle undercurrent of change had woven itself into the fabric of daily life, and though it was not immediately visible, it was there, a quiet reminder that some wounds, no matter how well hidden, do not heal completely. Her knitting needles clicked together in a soft, soothing rhythm, but her mind, sharp as ever, was far from the mundane task at hand. She had seen this before, the way a village absorbed its tragedies, its joys, its hidden pains, turning them over like soil in the garden, and moving forward. The people adjusted, some with quiet relief, others with a kind of energy born from the need to avoid facing darker corners of their own hearts. She understood it, had always understood it, and though it seemed strange, she admired it in a way. The village would carry on, its daily routine unbroken by the past, but Miss Marple knew that the true nature of St. Mary Mead was not in its outward simplicity. Beneath its neat hedgerows, beneath the calm smiles and quiet greetings, lay a world of secrets and half-truths, all carefully buried under the polite veneer of village life. Miss Marple smiled softly to herself, her eyes glinting with a knowingness that few could match. It was these very secrets, she mused, that made life in this village so endlessly fascinating. There was always something more beneath the surface, always another layer to peel away, another truth to uncover. The pasts carefully buried, the small deceptions that were never quite exposed, the half-truths whispered behind polite smiles, the illusion of simplicity that cleverly veiled the tangled mess beneath. She had seen it before, and she would see it again. With a quiet sigh, she lifted her cup for another sip, the warmth of the tea grounding her as she watched the world outside. For now the morning was peaceful, the village blissfully unaware of the undercurrents that still swirled beneath its quaint streets. But Miss Marple knew better. Mysteries, like the changing of the seasons, had a way of returning, of resurfacing when least expected. And St. Mary Mead, with all its quiet charm and carefully concealed intrigue, would continue to be a place where the truth lingered just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to be uncovered once more.